Coming up on tonight's episode of Faith versus Culture, a conversation on the rapture and the end times with Paul Lalonde from Left Behind, the Rise of the Antichrist. Coming up next.
To have sex before you marry is a bad idea.
Don't tell me there's no such thing as gun violence.
That just depends on your definition of when life begins.
There are problems of sin and habit that cannot be solved outside the person of our Lord Jesus Christ.
Well, hello and welcome to this episode of Faith versus Culture right here on the CBN News Channel. My name is Dan Andros. I'm the managing editor of CBN's FaithWire.com. Joined as always by Billy Hallowell. Billy, what's going on?
I'm doing well.
Well, look, this conversation today is, it's in your wheelhouse. You've written books on this topic, end times theology. And this next guest that we have coming on is dealing with that. And I think it's, look, regardless of where you fall on your eschatology, it's good to get Christians thinking eternally and thinking about this because I think it gives a sense of urgency that we can otherwise lose in a culture that's just, we're so busy with our day-to-days that I think a lot of times it's so easy for us to lose perspective.
Yeah, and it's a big part of Scripture, right? You look at the Old Testament is prophesying Jesus coming. Then you look at the New Testament, and there's things in the Old Testament as well that haven't yet quite come to fruition. So it's important that we understand all of Scripture. We don't have to obsess about these parts of it, but understand them and think about them because it matters to our faith. I'm excited because our guest, Paul Lalonde, he has been at the forefront of talking about these topics and doing it through entertainment in Hollywood, the Left Behind movie series. He has a new installment of that coming out. It's Left Behind, Rise of the Antichrist. And so we want to welcome Paul to the show today. Paul, how's it going?
Oh, it's going great. And I appreciate you guys taking time to talk to me.
So you've got this new installment of the film coming, and it's a sequel. It's exciting. It's coming in January. What made you want to dive into this again?
Well, I think the first thing that makes me want to dive into this again is the fact that, the vast majority of people still don't know anything about it, still don't know anything about prophecy, and that includes the church. That even includes the evangelical church. People have, as the Bible prophesied they have turned away from prophecy. And, there's a lot of different reasons that people have for that. And we're going to try and address as many of them as we can during the, with the movie and during the campaign for the movie. But the reality is we do not have the option of just not worrying about it. We are told that prophecy is important. Between a third and a half of the Bible is prophecy. I would invite people to finish the sentence at the judgment seat of, I knew it was all coming, but I didn't bother telling anybody or bother waiting and watching as you told me to, because I felt it was more important to blank. And I would like to hear what people say and what people think is a good reason to just ignore prophecy when we are told otherwise. And so that's why I just want to keep this going. I think prophecy is an extremely powerful message, a great tool for evangelism, and a way to approach people intellectually that may not be ready to be approached spiritually. And I think that's important too. And so there's a lot of reasons that there's great power in prophecy, and that's why I've been doing it for 30 years.
Yeah, you've been doing this for a while, and it's not a small undertaking to put a movie together, right? Creating a film and putting a film out there, getting it from start to finish is a major, major job, and you've done that. You are the producer and the writer of this film. What goes into making a Left Behind, from the research side all the way down to completion?
Well, the hardest thing about making a movie is raising the money. And the easiest part of making a movie is making the movie. And that's the thing that, that people don't always recognize, and why it's so challenging, why there's these long gaps, and especially in the Christian world, where most of the Hollywood infrastructure wants absolutely nothing to do with you. And so it's extremely challenging in that sense, just to try and get all of the people on board, and that's been a challenge all the way through. It's why it takes a long time, and but it's worth it.
I mean, there is a great cast in this one. It is phenomenal, and I'm interested. How is this one going to differ from the previous installment?
Well, the most important, the big difference is, if we're talking about the first installment being the 2014 Cage movie, which this is the sequel to, then the most obvious change is we have a whole new cast. And so I'm really excited about the cast. I really think we put a great group together. This movie's different than the 2014 movie because the objective is different. And in 2014, the objective was to try and get the word of prophecy beyond the choir. And so that's why we brought in Nicolas Cage and really tried to push this thing so that people who weren't Christians would see it, because for so long it's only been talking to the choir. Unfortunately, that meant that the choir didn't particularly enjoy the movie all that much, because they didn't want to see someone like Nicolas Cage in it. They didn't want to they wanted to see a full-on altar call and path to salvation and everything, which is what Christian movies do, but that wouldn't have worked for reaching beyond the choir. So that's what we tried. This time, we're back to trying to talk to Christians, trying to wake up Christians, trying to wake up pastors, and trying to alert people that we are in the very, very, very last days. And I think people are missing that. I think people aren't seeing that we're in the very last days because they're watching for the wrong things. But we live in a world where all of this can happen like that. We're living in the days of Noah. Unlike Noah, we have unlimited seats on our ark. And so Noah had an ark that only allowed animals and his immediate family. We've got 100 Queen Marys if we want them, and anyone we can put on it. So anybody who's saying, come quickly, Queen Mary, so I can get on and get out of here, let's fill all those seats. Let's try and make sure that every one of us has our own personal ark filled with as many people as we can. And that means getting out and telling people the truth, even if it's uncomfortable and even if they might not want to hear it. So I'm not even sure if I answered the question there. I was rambling.
No, you did. I mean, you gave us a lot to think about there, right? I mean, this is a huge topic. It's an important topic. And, there's a lot going on today. And your perspective is interesting because a lot of people would say, oh, no, we think that's the next event. It could happen in 1 second. So your perspective of, hey, maybe tomorrow, I don't think we're quite there today at this moment without these other things, is an intriguing perspective. But I have to ask you, leading up to this, now, there have been a number of movies, the original trilogy years ago, the Nick Cage one, and now this one. When we look at this, why do you think the books and the movies have had such a monumental impact? Because this has been a cultural phenomenon. The books are still selling like crazy.
Well, I think part of that is that the reality is the books are selling like, and same as the movies, are selling like crazy again, as opposed to continually through this entire 25 years. And the reality is that prophecy and mainstreaming of prophecy comes in waves, and it depends on what's going on in the world. And so when you look at the late 70s and Hal Lindsey and Late Great Planet Earth, and that was the number one non-fiction New York Times book of the whole 70s. That thing was huge about prophecy. The world was in turmoil. The world was confused because everything was changing. And next thing you know, Late Great Planet Earth, boom, right up to the top of the list. Then you wait another 20 years and you get to the millennium. You get to the late 90s. We're approaching the year 2000. People are talking about prophecy again. Then 2001, we have 9/11. And there's uncertainty. There's economic chaos. There's confusion. Who do we trust? Is this the end of the world? Boom, Left Behind, all the Cloud 10 movies, everything went crazy. Then it kind of dies off again. And here we are again, living in Orwell's 1984 every morning when we wake up. And so I think it's time again for a very decent wake-up call for prophecy. And I think this might be our last real opportunity to ride a wave before it all comes to pass. And remembering, as you well know, this generation started in 1948. It can't go on forever. And so all the people, the scoffers who are saying, where's the promise of his coming? All the people who were saying, oh, Hitler's the Antichrist, Hitler's the Antichrist, it has to be. Israel's not a nation yet. But people just ignore. They just go look at it and say, you know what, this all fits except for these couple of things. So let's ignore those and just focus here. And when you do that, you get everything wrong every single time. This time, we can actually say we are in the last days. The only way that it's not imminent is if a generation somehow is, 1,000 years or something, but it's not. And so the reality is, I believe that there will be people alive who see both Israel restored in 1948 and the return of Christ. That, to me, would explain what a generation means. And Jesus said this generation will not pass until all these things be fulfilled, which means including the tribulation. So however you're going to define a generation, you got from 1948 till now, add 7 years of tribulation, and that's how you can figure out how much time we've got.
Paul Lalonde, producer, writer for Left Behind, Rise of the Antichrist. Good conversation here. We're going to have more of it after the break. This is Faith versus Culture and the CBN News Channel. All right, we are back here on this episode of Faith versus Culture. Dan Andros here, Billy Hallowell there. We are talking to Paul Lalonde from the Left Behind movie, The Rise of the Antichrist, that is upcoming, and having a great conversation on all things end times related.
Paul, I want to pick it up here because I've known you for a long time, and I've always known you to really love theology, in particular, end times prophecy. What was it that really sort of attracted you to this? Because I know your salvation story is sort of intertwined in this. So I'd love to sort of hear that introduction into it.
Well, way back when, in the dark ages of the 1980s, my brother Peter had become a believer and was interested in prophecy, and so he wanted to start a newsletter, an email newsletter, or not email. There was no email then, but direct mail newsletter. And so he lived a few hundred miles away from me, and he would call me, several times a week, trying to talk me into coming and working with him, and we can do great stuff. And I thought it was a little bit crazy, but the more we talked about it, it sounded fun, and I had to admit that I found the prophecy fascinating. So I agreed to go up there and see what we could do, and we ended up being partners for 30 years, and so that was a lot of fun. But I was there for a long time. Writing about prophecy and producing stuff about prophecy, but not believing a word of it in the way that it needed to be believed. And so you could say, I would say to Peter so many times, I love the prophecy stuff. Tell me more about the image of the beast and the mark of the beast and all these cool things, but stop talking about Jesus. I'm trying to understand prophecy here. I'm trying to put the pieces together and figure out how somebody knew this stuff. And you keep interrupting me talking about Jesus. And he was very patient, and that lasted for a long time. But eventually it became undeniable. And I did have a huge roadblock up, and cognitive dissonance becomes part of it when your brother's trying to convince you, Jesus is the way, and you're trying to tell him he's crazy. Then cognitive dissonance builds up, and he's going to need a whole lot more persuasive powers by the end and the beginning. And so it took a while. Eventually it becomes undeniable. And as you as you study it and dig more into the word and understand the word more, I think it all starts to become clearer and things start to make sense. And if you approach prophecy purely from an intellectual bent, you won't get it. You won't understand it. And you certainly won't be able to understand its fulfillment in the real world, because you're going to be deceived. And the disciples asked Jesus, what are the signs of the end and the sign of your coming? And the first thing he said was, take heed that no man deceive you. So the fact is, we live in the age of deception. We get lied to 150 times a day on the news and everywhere we turn. And so it's pretty undeniable. And I think people need to see that. And I think that's why there's power in prophecy, as I had mentioned before, to go after the intellectual part of the brain and not necessarily the spiritually seeking part of the brain for prophecy.
That's really interesting, especially when you look in the Old Testament too. Jeremiah, these are prophets sent by God, and Jeremiah's like, "Hey, you're not going to believe what I'm going to say. You're just going to go against it." And they're like, "No, tell us." And he tells them, and they're like, "Oh, this guy's full of it."
Yeah.
So exactly that denial, like what you were just talking about there, people that who aren't approaching this and really, looking at it from a faith lens, are just not going to get it. So I'm curious,
Absolutely.
what are a couple things? I'm sure you could probably go on and on about this, but what are a couple things you could pick out that sort of started connecting the dots for you? Maybe one or two of the more prominent things that stood out to you that you started to go, oh yeah, okay, yeah, this is it.
Well, I think the biggest part of that was the fact that we happen to be in the generation that can actually see all these things be fulfilled. And that's something that a guy in 1700s couldn't have said. And certainly not a guy in, before Christ. The fact is, they had a very clear outline of what was going to happen. And now when we look, it's like, whoa, it's actually happened. When they sit there and say, we're going to have the mark of the beast. We've been talking about the mark of the beast since the 1980s and talking about it on This Week in Bible Prophecy, our TV show 20 years ago. And I go back and look at it now, and it's amazing because we're holding up these little RFID chips and we're saying, wow, look, they've got chips now. They can hold so much information. They never had this before. You could have a mark of the beast. So what? It was a chip. So that didn't mean you can have this chip tomorrow. There was no internet. There was no Bitcoin or any of the blockchain technology that would make a world currency possible. There was no option of just getting rid of paper money. And there was certainly no option of being able to control the buying and selling of every single person on the planet. That can happen now. It couldn't happen before. And that's one example, and there's many of them. And even war, they talk about if God didn't step in and stop the war, there would be no flesh saved. Well, if that's written in 1000 BC, what, every man on the planet is going to kill every other man on the planet with a spear? That's just not realistic. So when God steps in and says there would be no flesh saved, that sounds to me like we're stepping in to stop a Holocaust, not stepping in to stop a gladiator brawl in the desert. So that's, it's just those kind of things that all make sense in light of what we're seeing today. And it must have been very frustrating to study prophecy in 1200 when nothing had happened and nothing made sense. But God told Daniel, or Jesus, lock up these words till the time of the end, basically saying these aren't going to make sense until it's time. But when the time comes, it will make sense. And it does. And when you start reading it, it does make sense. But people still think, oh, I have to go to Dallas Theological Seminary for 12 years in order to understand prophecy. No, you don't. No, you don't. It's not all heads and horns and beasts. This is not unclear. And when the Bible says, oh Gog, I'm gonna put a hook in your jaw and draw you toward the homeland, that people might look at that. I don't have a clue what that means. Well, it's pretty simple. God's going to turn Russia toward Israel. There you go. If people just understand and take the time to realize what is being said, and it's really not that confusing. It's not that hard.
Well, there's a lot to think about there, and a lot to talk about. The film is Left Behind: Rise of the Antichrist. Paul, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, it was great. I appreciate it. And, sorry if I was rambling.
No, you were great. You were great. We'll be right back in just a moment with more Faith versus Culture here on the CBN News Channel.
All right, we're back on this episode of Faith versus Culture. Dan Andros here, Billy Hallowell there, wrapping up our interview there. And, you know, it was a great conversation, Billy. Always fascinating. I know this is a topic that you've written about. Always fascinating to dive into end time stuff. And this movie has been popular. And it's interesting he talked about that dynamic between unbelievers and believers. Believers want it to be, you know, an altar call, he said, basically, but he's trying to find that balance.
Yeah. Well, and how you use Hollywood, how you use this vehicle to reach people. And they've tried different things that sometimes haven't worked or sometimes have worked. But taking like art and using it to bring the Bible to life, I think that's a pretty interesting and cool thing to do.
Yeah. And look, the general rule of thumb, anytime you produce anything in media, news, podcasting, blogs, anything, you will never make everyone happy. I mean, just go into it knowing if you're thinking about creating something, understand people are going to be mad. That's just what they do.
You're always going to have haters, always.
You're going to have haters no matter what you do. So, but nevertheless, fascinating stuff. And we're glad to have that conversation here today. Hopefully getting your perspective, thinking eternally, if you were drowned in the day-to-day busyness of this life. So we'll be back to wrap up this episode of Faith versus Culture on the other side of the break. All right, that is all the time we have for this episode of Faith versus Culture here on the CBN News Channel. As always, you can catch more of us, Billy, myself, Tragons Phillips, over on the CBN News Quick Start podcast. Follow that on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts, and you can catch us every weekday at 7 a.m. and also here on Faith versus Culture each week. So God bless. We'll see you all next time.